G'day everyone, welcome back to the channel. So today's video is going to be about patellofemoral joint dysfunction. So dysfunction in and around that kneecap. And this video is for anyone who is obviously suffering from patellofemoral joint syndrome, but anyone who basically wants their knees to function better. Because what we're going to go through in the first half of the video, we're going to talk about, I guess, what it is first and foremost, but how it happens and some of the broader mechanical issues that tend to set that kneecap up to fail or to become sore, particularly around that sort of soft tissue around the area. And in the second half of the video, once we have a really good understanding about the mechanisms that cause patellofemoral joint syndrome, we're going to go through about 4 exercises that will hopefully address really important features of that dysfunction, so that by the end of the video, you have a really great and powerful understanding of what it is, and then how, I guess, what you need to go through and what you need to get to or get at in order to fix it and to make sure that you used to be someone who had patellofemoral joint syndrome and not someone who consistently has it or it comes back. Because I think one of the things in the industry that we sort of focus on too much is, and this may sound strange out of context, but it will make a lot of sense hopefully by the end of the video, is that we tend to focus too much on the kneecap itself. In the industry, the medical industry, not just physical therapy or other health professions, but I think the broader medical industry tends to focus a little too much on just the symptoms of where your pain is. So again, you may have some pain on the outer edge of that kneecap. You might feel like there's some pain under the kneecap, even on the inside of the kneecap for some people. And while that's ultimately really important, the exercises and the ideas that I want to promote today, we're going to talk a little bit more broadly to try and get to some of those root underlying causes. So basically, to get into it, what we want to talk about first, we want to talk about what it is. And essentially, when we talk about patellofemoral joint syndrome, you'll often hear the words maltracking patella. And basically what that means is the knee itself has a bit of a bony shelf or a subtle bony channel that kneecap is designed to slide up and down in when you bend and straighten your knee. Now, what we tend to find is that kneecap can get pulled off to the side a little bit more. It can sort of butt up against or compress more so than it should up against sort of the bony aspect on the lateral side of the knee, or the more lateral aspect of the channel of the knee. And it can create some irritation, it can create some damage, it can create some soft tissue dysfunction, a whole range of problems that can stop you from doing what you want to do. And what we often see traditionally is we often talk about something called a Q angle, which is essentially the angle of your femur or your leg, the angle of your shin, and the direction that the kneecap travels within that. And what we see a lot with patellofemoral joint syndrome is we often see a leg that often tends to want to dump inwards. And the reason why that's important is that if your legs are linear and relatively straight, and you bend and flex those knees, technically that kneecap should just travel, or relatively travel, compared to the femur and the shin, essentially straight up and down, or in a vertical plane more so than anything. But as soon as we start to introduce a little bit of that valgus force, where the knee collapses in a little bit, all of a sudden that angle that's created by the patellar tendon and the quads tendon that attach into the patella itself, instead of being relatively linear, all of a sudden we're creating this extra angle, this oblique angle that can tend to force the kneecap more into the outside position. So what we often see with a lot of people who, when we're trying to sort of treat the patellofemoral joint syndrome, you'll often see some taping that tends to try to pull the patella itself more medially, give you a bit more space through there, and try and correct some of that local dysfunction. But the point I want to really get across today is that this movement pattern of bending your knee needs to not be this movement pattern where your knee's collapsing inwards. And what I think is really important here, and we don't necessarily focus on this enough, is that if I'm in a really good position, those knees should stay relatively stable and track in a linear plane. But if we find that if you have some ankle stiffness, some hip stiffness, or some hip weakness, we often see that leg, the whole leg tends to dump inwards a little bit more to compensate, or as a consequence of those dysfunctions. So essentially someone's sort of in this wobbly position as opposed to being in this really strong, stable shape. So we need to make sure that the exercises that we give you are not just treating the local dysfunction that's occurred from this, but actually trying to correct that leg position as a whole. And the way we can do that is with 4 really basic exercises. So the point I wanted to make with this is that we definitely need to respect how that patellofemoral joint feels. If it's irritated, if it's inflamed, there's clearly some steps that you can do to try and get that local dysfunction back under control. Again, taping, physical therapy, massage, whatever it may be that makes that sort of feel a bit better is completely fine. But this video is more sort of trying to get at the cause of it, which could hopefully settle down your symptoms irrespective of what's going on down here. But again, if you're doing this and if it really helps you, the local symptomatic stuff, keep it up. Just make sure that you're adding in these other exercises as well, so that you're not having to do this forever, that you can sort of get beyond this and move on and back to what you want to do day to day. So the first thing we want to get to is we want to get to some ankle stiffness. Now, one of the things we see with stiff ankles, again, we've done this a lot on the channel, but hopefully you can see this. If you're designed to have a certain amount of ankle range, but you don't have that ankle range, what your body tends to do is, instead of being able to bend in the plane that it's designed to bend, it'll get to the point where it gets stiff and your body will have to find a way around that stiffness. Now, your leg can't rotate out further generally without your foot lifting, but it can dump inwards. And ankle stiffness is one of the biggest mechanical compromises that we see that can set you up for patellofemoral joint syndrome. And the tricky thing about that is stiff ankles generally don't have a really overt symptom attached to them. They don't necessarily hurt. They don't necessarily feel tight like a lot of muscular tightness does. It's often a hidden feature of most people's mechanics that you can only get at if you know what you're looking for. And in order to get at it and to try and solve that sort of ankle stiffness, we want to use what's called a power band. Again, we've done this a lot on the channel before. I think even the last video that we posted covers this in a little bit of depth, but I'll leave a link in the description. Power bands are these fantastic sort of strong rubber bands that are really good at getting at the joint stiffness, the deeper joint stiffness, the rustiness associated with most ankle restrictions. But you can use anything with a bit of elastic in it. So quickly, what we want to get you to do is you just want the band around the base of your ankle. I want you to stretch the band out as far as you feel comfortable. Hopefully you can see this. Step through with your other leg. And what we want to do here is just bend your back ankle as far as you feel comfortable. Now, we say this a lot, but we want to make sure that you're not just sitting down on the stretch. We don't want to turn this into an active quads exercise. We want your hips to go past your foot, your back foot, and then we want to tension up that back ankle as much as we can. And looking at it from the front, obviously with the band pulling backwards, we don't want to buy into this knee in position. We want your foot on the ground flat, toes on the ground, but we want you to rotate your knee outwards as far as it'll go as you're going forwards. So how it looks basically is the knee is rotated out without your foot wanting to come off the ground, and you're bending that ankle as far as you feel comfortable. And you should be able to find a position where you feel like you're leveraging a lot of tension through the base of that ankle without feeling like you're working too hard here. I'm going to stay here for 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, as long as you feel you need to make change. You can oscillate in and out of that shape if you want to as well, but you've got to be pushing those outer corners of your ankle range and not letting that leg dump inwards, which it's going to want to do in a lot of these cases. So that's exercise number one. So, excuse me. So we want to try and take away some of the restriction at the base of the ankle, the base of the leg, that forces the knee to be put into a position that isolates and influences the function of that kneecap and contributes to it getting sore. So again, we want to take one of those handbrakes off from below so that the structure that's caught in the middle is able to be loaded better and to settle down long term. Now, the second exercise, again, still playing into this theme of trying to get the leg out more and not letting that leg dump in at all, is we want to basically create that sort of external rotation at the hip. So a lot of the times, one of the reasons why we can't get out of this position is because we don't have the rotation in the hip to get that out. So again, if we can unglue the ankle, the bottom part of this mechanism, and then unglue the hip, and it'll allow us to put ourselves into a better position. And a really simple way to do that is with what's called the pigeon stretch or the pigeon pose. So again, you can do this up on a chair or a bed if you want to. I'll do this on the floor, hopefully again if you can see this. It's essentially this externally rotated position, and you're just dropping down as far as you feel comfortable. So again, you can do this up on something, as I said, but this is more of a muscular stretch. And what we want to get you to do here is keeping your back relatively straight, just shifting your hips around, seeing if you can find some tightness in those glutes. And then once you've found something, we want to give it a good squeeze for a few seconds. And then when you relax, you might find you can drop down a little bit deeper than you could before. Same thing again, breath in, give it a good squeeze that for a few seconds. So we're trying to squeeze the muscles that feel tight here And then when you relax, you should feel like it drops down a little bit deeper. So again, the position that we're stretching here is that externally rotated position, so that when you're doing your movements and your squats, that knee all of a sudden has more room to move. So we're not spending our lives in this position, trying to get out of that shape into a better shape. So we want to create some hip external rotation, excuse me, free up as much of that sort of tight soft tissue as possible, so that you have the capacity to push your knee in a better position, settle down that patellofemoral joint, and any of the irritated structures around that. So, excuse me, I don't know why I'm puffing, but I am. So the third exercise is the couch stretch. And again, we've covered this a lot on the channel. It's one of the best exercises you will ever do for the health and function of your musculoskeletal system. Essentially what we're going to look for here, and if you've done the couch stretch before, you'll know really well what it does, but we want to make sure that we're looking at some of that hip flexor tightness, but also some of the tightness down through the quads. Now, we know that the patellofemoral joint is highly sensitive to being put in a poorly sort of internally rotated leg position, which loads up the kneecap and changes the way that it's loaded and becomes uncomfortable. But we also find that a lot of the tightness through the quads can also pull a lot of slack out of the kneecap. So, so basically what we see is through a lot of sitting, a lot of dysfunction can occur, and those thigh muscles, those hip muscles become tight, essentially put a little bit of extra tension through the kneecap. And then when it's put into this sort of internally rotated position, this valgus position, again, it's just another change in the way that it's loaded. So again, the way to do the couch stretch, you can do this up on a chair, obviously, but again, for the purposes of this, we'll do it on the floor. So again, we want your knee in the back corner, shin relatively vertical, hips relatively in line, and then when you get your other leg up into a sort of a high lunge position. And then what we want to do for this is we want to come straight up. So squeezing that back glute, we want you to come as vertical as you feel comfortable. We're looking to capture any of the tightness at the front of the hip, but also down through the front of the thigh that sort of attaches into that sort of irritated, overloaded kneecap. Now, this can be a brutal stretch for a lot of people, so please do this with your back knee up on a chair. It's much easier. Also, you may find that if it's very restricted here, you won't be able to sort of break into that vertical position very easily without sort of either sort of hinging through your back or, you know, passing out and not being able to breathe. So you might find for you that you can only get half the way up to begin with. It's completely fine. Doesn't matter where you are, as long as you're finding some tightness at the front here. So as with what we did with the pigeon stretch, we want to make sure that you activate those tight muscles. So you want to put yourself in a position where you can find some tightness. Deep breath in. You want to squeeze, tense up all the muscles that feel tight. In this, you can push your foot back into the surface that it's up against to really activate those thigh muscles. Hold it for 5 to 10 seconds. Then relax. You should be able to go a little bit further than you could before, and just keep repeating this process for as long as you feel it takes to stop making change, or until you get sick of doing it. But basically, you should see that it makes an immediate difference. If kneeling on your knee feels uncomfortable, if that kneecap doesn't tolerate this, you can put a cushion or a pillow underneath. If you're doing it up on a chair, it'll feel obviously a little bit better. The interesting thing is, if you're doing this correctly, you'll actually be spending more time above the kneecap. So you sort of be on the sort of the tissue just at the base of the thigh. So if you're putting that pressure on the kneecap, it probably tells us that when you're in this position, that you're probably too vertical in that stretch. You can sort of take a bit of a lunge forward first, and then come up from that position so that the pressure on the knee shifts to above that kneecap. Excuse me. So those 3 exercises to begin with are really powerful exercises to unglue 3 of the main restrictions that force the knee into a less than perfect shape that can set you up for patellofemoral joint syndrome. So stiff ankle, tight hip rotators, and tight hip flexors / quads can all create an environment that pulls slack and force your body to move in a different way, with the consequence being that patellofemoral joint becoming sore. Now, the 4th exercise and the final exercise that we want to do to tie all this in together is we've covered some mobility work, so we want to make sure that you're working on some strength aspects to reinforce a good leg position. So we can do this through squatting, which is obviously really simple, but the key point here is we know that a lot of knee dysfunction occurs when we're sort of defaulting or dumping into this internally rotated leg position. And we want to make sure that in order to load that kneecap up in a better way, we want to promote a more knees out position. So we can do this with some squats. So what I'll get you guys to do is with your feet straight, if you can screw your knees out before you even begin, and if you look down at your feet, and you can't see this on me, I don't think, you might be able to now. So if I'm in an internally rotated position, the arches of my feet collapse. When I'm in a more externally rotated position, not only is my knee placed into a better shape and my patella's loaded better, but the arches of my feet lift up. So we want to create this tensile position, or this strong shape, feet straight, knees out, lifts your arch up, puts your kneecap in a better position, engages the muscles in your glutes to hold you there. And what we want to do is we want to squat with this in mind. So we want to make sure that your feet, your arches, your heels don't shift in any way. And essentially by rotating your knees out, you're almost gluing them into a set of tracks so that when you squat down, those knees should just go in and out of that plane consistently without too much of a wobble or a deviation. And if you can do enough of these, you'll find that the muscles in your glutes, the muscles in your bum will start to fatigue really well. You'll also start to include the VMO, the big muscle, the teardrop muscle on the inside of the thigh. And what you'll find, and that didn't do much for my puffing, and what you'll find is by engaging that position more often, you'll start to train the right muscles to hold your leg in the right pattern, so that when you're running, jumping, playing, doing whatever you need to do, then your body will be more inclined to stay in that position as opposed to dumping inwards and creating that dysfunction through the patellofemoral joint. So if squats are too easy, obviously you can add some weight to that. You can add a band around your knees, one of those booty bands, and then you can sort of improve the strength of those hip muscles, strength of those quads with weight and bands as well, as I said. So those 4 exercises, apart from puffing and talking at the same time, are relatively easy to do. So if you can make sure that you're seeing some improvements immediately with the mobility work, and then consistently working hard each day on fatiguing yourself while squatting, if you do enough of them, you will feel it more so through your inner quads and through your glutes. And then you'll know that you're making some progress towards sort of wiping that slate clean again and getting to the underlying cause of that patellofemoral joint dysfunction. So that being said, hopefully that's a really good understanding or a quick guide to what patellofemoral joint syndrome is in the broader context of your entire leg, not just a kneecap or a patella that's maltracking. There's more to it than just that isolated dysfunction, and hopefully we can sort of show you that today. Hopefully it makes sense, but more importantly, if you have it and you do these exercises, hopefully you'll see that you can start to sort of steer that ship in a better direction and ultimately conquer those symptoms and that dysfunction really quickly, and then get back to doing what you want to do pain-free. So if you went on to enjoy this video, if you found it useful, let me know in the comments below. As always, how long have you had your patellofemoral joint syndrome before? What have you done that's worked? What hasn't worked? Are you having a good experience with it, if there is such a thing? Is it ultimately a bad experience or a frustrating one? Do the ideas in this video sort of connect a few dots that maybe weren't connected previously for you? And if you did find it useful, we'd really appreciate it if you consider leaving a like on the video and also subscribing to the channel, just so that these ideas, these videos, and an Australian guy puffing for no reason can get out to more people. Because I think we've become really good as a medical industry at being very specialized and very specific with certain things. We're optimizing, getting your VMO stronger, and we're working on taping better, and we're understanding sort of the specifics of what's going on at that kneecap. But I think it speaks to the broader idea that there's a lot more going on that we need to address, that we're probably not touching on as well as we could at the moment, but we're getting there. So hopefully these ideas can help sort of solidify a lot of that information for a lot of people. So as always, thanks for joining us. Stay tuned for the next video, and we'll see you then. Bye.